Hello, my name is Yoav Kabanchik from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and the topic I will be describing is human iron economy in health and disease in the 21st century. Now, let me start by saying that iron was considered to be, by our ancestors, as a celestial metal, a metal that came from the outer space. And this is particularly had to do with meteorites that fell on our planet. And the Egyptians were the one that worshipped more than anyone else this metal for having very unique properties. Uh, I think it was Paracelsus himself that referred very specific to iron as a unique metal, in claiming that many of the unique properties of iron has the attributes of Mars. But also, he claimed that he who knows Mars knows also the qualities of iron. Uh, I think this was not really based on any particular property, health property related to the metal, but its mere presence in the universe. And it was worshipped by him as it was worshipped by many others for this particular property. Um, However, when we are dealing with life per se, we know these days that due to its unique properties, iron was most probably involved in the formation of many of the organic species that occurred billions of years ago, in particular areas where most probably life originated. And this had to do with hydrothermal vents uh, that erupted all kind of gases from the center of our planet, very rich in metals, in sulfur, hydrogen, and created a very special environment and conditions for the production of organic molecules that reacted spontaneously, one with the other, due to the unique forms of the metal that, especially iron, but also nickel. And they probably are associated with biomolecules in the so-called primordial soup, where life originated. But I think the direct evidence that we have that for billions of years iron participated in living creatures is what we are finding in the banded iron forms. Um, so those are iron oxide forms that deposited due either to ultraviolet radiation or later on when oxygen appeared in the atmosphere. And in some of these layers, we can find also sediments that are related to living creatures from the type of molecules or biomolecules that we know today. So we can more or less have an idea about how prevalent iron was in the very old species that are found in different places, not just in one. But iron is also perceived somewhat different in relation to life, because in the absence of iron, we know that there is chlorosis in plants, also in human beings, and it can even lead to death. Iron was taken as a sign of eternity in some of the cultures. And we know today, cosmologically, that iron is one of the most stable of the metals. So at the end of the world, perhaps everything might be converted into iron, being a such stable element. But iron was also perceived for other properties, like fertility in the case in the Greek mythology. And this has an importance also in medicine because many of the tales in the mythology were adopted by the Hippocratic school. And when proven to be right, they were taught in the different schools also that follow, especially the Galenic school, that had a tremendous influence on medicine until the 19th century. Now, of course, we try to relate iron with human character. The two best examples I can find is the Bismarck, and his famous idiom, blood and iron, that he utilized a lot. as a motor for the unification of Germany. Obviously, blood in this case, not in the medical sense. That is a price you have to pay for unification. And iron was the instrument for it. And obviously, in character, maybe one of the best examples is that of Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady. Very famous for a unique character, a very strong character, and a very determined one that has been reflected in her act and in many of also her speeches. But here I want to just relate to some basic facts that you should know in order to understand the iron economy in our organism. And if we take an average man or woman of, let's say, 60 to 70 kilos in an adult person, the amount of iron that he has in the body is approximately, on the average, 3 grams, could be from 2.5 to 3.5, depending on, say, women or men. And the interesting thing about the metal in our organism is that the only site we can absorb the metal in our entire gut is in the duodenum, namely immediately after the stomach. And if not there, then iron is simply lost. We only absorbed about 1 to 2 milligrams a day to just maintain our body in homeostasis. We don't need more than that. Except in cases where there are some losses, so we have to compensate. But the interesting thing also is the only form which iron is being taken up into our blood from the gut is in a reduced form. But it also depends quite a lot the efficacy of absorption on how is iron presented to the gut and what happens to the part of the iron that accompanies it. Usually iron comes as complexes, and those can affect a lot the accessibility of the metal. But one unique situation that we have to deal with primarily and find a solution to it is that in all inflammatory conditions, the absorption of iron is absolutely blocked, depending on the degree of course, of inflammation. And that's irrespective of the source of the metal, whether it's nutritional, whether it is artificial, whether it is inorganic or organic. There's no difference. The blockage is complete. And how can we overcome that? Because iron deficiency can be also very dangerous and even lethal. So we are going to address these issues. And let's just provide you, first of all, with another property that we should remember with respect to iron. We mostly connect iron with blood and with respiration, because oxygen, which is taken up through the lungs into the blood, it's bound essentially to hemoglobin within red cells, and this hemoglobin will distribute the oxygen to all the tissues in our body. And iron has a very important role in the hemoglobin. There are 4 centers in the protein, and the iron sits usually together or inside this group called heme, which is a group that we find it in the hemoglobin, in the protein, and that's very crucial for binding of the oxygen. So without iron, there is essentially no binding of oxygen in our body. So this plays an extremely important role in survival of humans. But something not less important that we have to address here is the fact that all the cells from our organism require iron in order to function. In fact, 30% of all the functions of the cell depend on the metal. So some interesting questions being asked here: why is it that this metal was selected for it? Why is it so essential? And why it can't be replaced, at least very easily? So now let's start with some numbers just to understand the area. First of all, we know that iron is absolutely essential because when there is a deficiency in the metal, eventually we are going to get anemic, and this is going to have very severe consequences. But the mere deficiency of the metal already causes a lot of clinical difficulties. How do we define deficiency? Now, first of all, let's say that this iron deficiency is highly prevalent. It's about 50% of the cases of anemia worldwide, and represent about 1.6 billion people, at least from the numbers provided by the World Health Organization. And they have not changed that dramatically from 2015. So we have two types of deficiencies in iron. One which is called absolute deficiency. So when we lose a lot of blood for different reasons, we become deficient. This can also be because of nutritional problems as well. So iron deficiency anemia, essentially absolute iron deficiency anemia, is done to this is done due to different reasons. Could be nutritional deficiencies, but also could be just blood loss. And it could also be iatrogenic, namely caused by some particular treatments like chemotherapy that can affect seriously the iron status of the body. Now, the other side of the story is the so-called functional deficiency. Now, functional deficiency is to do primarily with inability to utilize the iron. And this occurs a lot in chronic inflammation. And what is unique about that is that no matter which form of iron one is given orally, nothing has been absorbed, or very little has been absorbed. So we have a functional problem here. And that's the reason we call it functional iron deficiency. This one, the iron deficiency, the absolute deficiency, can be corrected just simply by supplementing iron. But the functional iron deficiency cannot be, at least not by the common route via mouth, because the entry to the duodenum is completely blocked. Now, anemia is a state that's much easier to define based on the levels of hemoglobin, which are different for males and females. And this is just an average value. It may change slightly from country to country, but that's more or less in the ballpark. The iron deficiency itself is just measured here by two factors that we are going to describe a little bit later. That's more for clinical purposes, but also for understanding a little bit the mechanism as well. There are some other situations in which we have a combination of both we are not going to address now. Now, the signs of iron deficiency differ slightly in different people, but overall, of course, what we have are, first of all, lower iron blood levels, and due to that, lower oxygen delivery to tissues. There's breath shortness, pallor, chlorosis, when the skin becomes pale or sometimes even green in the case of chlorosis. The skin gets dry, strong headaches, and chronic fatigue, and some other, which we are going to use in a short while, which is the shortening of the skeletal muscle and the concave brittle nails. So the nails become concave and brittle. And there are eventually also palpitation, diabetes, and many other complications. Now, interesting here, these are the most common of the features of iron deficiency, which are also in many of the cases end up with anemia. But here we have two other factors which have been used actually for trying to identify anemia in the old times, when there are, of course, we have no access to all the other parameters. People have been dead. But at least, for the shortening of skeletal muscle and the nails, we know that there was a very serious anemia that erupted in the transition period from the times that we were hunters and gatherers. In fact, were carnivores, if you like. So we had an iron-rich diet, and we moved to agriculture, where the diet became considerably less rich in iron and poorly absorbed the metal from the plant sources which were cultivated. And we have also some indirect proof for that, because some of the mutations which favor the people that hyperabsorb the iron, like the HFE mutation that causes this called hemochromatosis, But one of the manifestations is that these people absorb a lot more iron than a normal person. So even though some of them hemochromatotic might have been vegetarians, because of the higher ability to absorb iron, more efficiency, with higher efficiency, they had a survival advantage. Now, that is very important in the growing phase of a person, especially to reach until it reaches maturity, and those are the years also of fertility as well. But later on to age, we continue to accumulate iron, and so this becomes deleterious. So what favors us as a young person could be deleterious when we are old, and that's what happened in those patients that have hemochromatosis. Now, one of the interesting issues that one can speculate was if anemic, if we assume that she only had a vegetarian diet, well, she was usually painted as being extremely anemic. Those were in the old days paintings. And these days, I think the perception of Eve may have changed, and we know that the diet has also changed quite a bit. Although she still may have here an apple, but the man offers an alternative source of food, which also, attracted very much the snake. Now, was it actually a hamburger, as it shows here? And if in these days, I don't think it's much of a problem. It could be a hamburger. It doesn't mean it has to be a non-vegetarian one, because we know that today we have this option of having an hamburger, a vegetarian hamburger, although it has a little bit higher calories than the non-vegetarian one. Actually, it's a cheeseburger. Now, interesting enough, the vegan hamburger, which is made of soya, has exactly the same amount of iron per 100 grams of the sandwich. And although the recommended daily intake is about 8 milligrams of iron, we can say definitely that this does not represent this number absolutely anything in relation here to the numbers that are presented there, because in the case of soya, only 10% of those 2 to 3 milligrams are absorbed, depending on the form that the iron is presented in the soya, whereas in the red meat is 30%, so considerably more efficient as an iron source. Now, this is an important message because it means that we not only have to look at how much is in the bottle, but in which form, which normally is not being presented in the labels. And that's, I think, extremely important in trying to choose a proper source of the metal in case of a deficiency. Well, Melampus at the time, according to the Greek mythology at least, he was an extremely smart person that will always refer for advice or invited for advice. And he had to resolve a big problem to get released from a prison. And that relates to the impotence or the infertility of the son of Iphiclus, the king Iphiclus. And he asked for advice, as usually he did, from the different animals. He understood their language. And he apparently heard about a solution which was provided by the eagles, that the way to cure infertility is to use an iron source. Because as an iron source, he suggested the king to ask his son to drink from a liquor made out of a rusted knife, which was left for a few days in wine, probably vinegar, acid wine, and that apparently, made it rich in iron. And sure enough, after a few days, according to the legend, he became fertile, and in 9 months he had more around that time. He had a son, and everyone was happy with it. Now, the importance of this is because this type of legend was used quite a lot in Hippocratic medicine to make suggestions to people to try different sources of the metal in order to fortify them. Not quite this suggestion made by Melampus, but different ones, particularly taken from shallow baths, so those are springs of ferruginous water, and water rich in iron. Looks pretty much here like rusted water, if you like. And this kind of waters was used, like miracle waters. Like for instance, we see that in this poem written by a physician and a poet in the 17th century, saying that these waters youth in age renew, strength to the weak and sickly add, give the pale cheek rosy hue, and cheerful spirits to the sad. So magical water obviously had some commercial value because it didn't pass along before those waters were bottled and sold. And in order to save space, some of that was also evaporated and sold as pills. There are even indications that Romans, in their long journeys, took also pills rich in iron because of the poor diet they had during their long voyages. And today, sure enough, the waters from these spring of Trefu are in fact put in bags of 25 milliliters that have 5 milligrams of ferrous sulfate in acidic pH. So this natural water from a spring are being sold as an iron supplement all over the world. Now, Israel is particularly interesting that recently they came up with a kosher formula of iron. I'm not sure exactly what it means to be kosher in the case of iron, but at least they say kosher means clean. Again, I cannot tell exactly what is the meaning behind that, except that this is probably sold to a particular kind of people that think that everything has to be kosher, including iron. Now, I guess that Melampus today would have a big problem deciding which form of iron to take. They're all more or less the same. They are salts, organic salts, most of them, or inorganic. And sometimes the only difference is just the name. In Europe, they like to use Eurofer, in Russia, Russian iron. And there is nature-made iron, which actually is just simply iron sulfate. But the company is called nature-made. There is iron for women, and there is iron for men, and for extra males, and for children, and you name it. But there is also fake forms of iron which have been advertised, like in the case of Popeye with spinach. Spinach is very rich in iron, but none of it is absorbed. So how come it became so strong? Well, it's because spinach has vitamin A, which is also very important, but not actually as an absorbable source of iron. There is iron there, but it's not well absorbed or not absorbed at all. And sometimes there are some statements which are made that are truth, but everyone can understand it any way he wants it, like this one, that becoming a vegetarian is a big mistake, which is correct, but the implications for that and the interpretation I can leave to anywhere. Now let's be a little bit serious and now and go more to the physiology of iron. What is iron so essential and what makes it so unique? Well, we already mentioned that 30% of the cell activities depend on this metal, whether it's oxygen sensing in the cells and the utilization by cells that are needed for the production of energy, the synthesis of DNA bases, the synthesis of collagen, neurotransmitter, many others depend on proteins that have iron in their center. And the fact is that when there is iron deficiency, there is essentially a major dysfunction of most of the cells. Their functions are compromised, the cell survival is compromised. And this has been reflected, many different ways, like in the case of a plant with sclerosis. In humans, we have, very typical characteristics, some of which I mentioned to you before. But the important thing about iron that is going to be important for the next part of the talk is we are talking here about the double-edged metal, or metal with double-edged features, that on the one hand absolutely essential and beneficial, but on the other hand is potentially dangerous, because iron is also a reactive metal that can react with oxygen and produce noxious oxidants, and they can damage the DNA. So clearly we have to regulate that very, very much, or we'll never reach stages that it can damage the cells. So we have to prevent as much as possible to get any iron overload, because they can produce damage and eventually lead even to a death path, which is called ferroptosis. It's a planned path of death. So we need a very balancing economy. And the question is, how do we keep a balanced economy for this matter? And if there is any fault, how do we correct it? So those are things we are going to deal with in this talk. But also to deal with another dialectic question is, if iron is so dangerous, also, why was it chosen to lead to so many essential reactions? Why hasn't evolution led to better and less dangerous agents without the iron itself, or with the iron in a different form? Now, first of all, let's start here by some very basic facts about our body that we need to understand. So we have between 2.5 to 3.5 grams of iron, which is more or less the weight of a coin. And I said to you that most of this iron in our body is essentially involved in binding of oxygen and distribution of oxygen, and 20% of it in storage, but only 5%, which means 150 milligrams of all the iron in the body, is essentially involved in metabolism and absolutely required by all the cells in our organism to function properly. So this is a very centralized or monopolistic type of economy that we have, putting a lot of weight on just one metal. But what's even more interesting is, how do we maintain our daily flow of this metal in our body? So I mentioned before that all we need per day is 1.2 milligrams to absorb through the diet, and that all that is absorbed in the duodenum, which is the first part of the intestine, the long intestine. So this 1.2 milligrams actually doesn't accumulate in the body, because 1.2 milligrams is exactly what we are losing per day, because cells that die, they slough out, and together with them we lose this iron per day. 1.2 milligrams, let's say, from the skin or from the gut. Cells, they are replaced all the time and we lose them. So we have to recover this 1.2 milligrams, and the pool here that connects between all the different organs is the blood, or if you like, the blood fluid, which is the plasma. So essentially, when we use 1.2 milligrams here, we are going to tell the duodenum, bring in 1.2 milligrams to compensate for that loss. And everything has to occur here. I mean, here is to be sent the iron, because that's the compartment that links here the two. How this is done is simply by, this is done essentially by signaling to the liver that we have reached a particular level of iron in the plasma, and then the liver sends a signal back, blocking any further uptake of the metal. So what we have here is called a ferrostat, almost like by analogy, a thermostat, that instead of keeping a constant temperature, we keep here a constant concentration of the metal in the plasma. And when it goes up too much from a particular threshold, now we signal to the liver to tell back the system to stop bringing more iron. So that's called a feedback mechanism, very similar to what we have with temperature in the thermostat. And the effector that comes from the liver that will lead to a blockage in the duodenum is a hormone called hepcidin or hepcidin. That this will eventually lead to closing off the gates of entry of the metal into the body. Now, this is some sort of simplification, because we have the rest of the body that we have to deal with. The liver is not just separated from the rest of the body, but it's connected here through the plasma. And what is important to say is that every day we essentially destroy 1% of the old red blood cells, and they are digested in the spleen, and all the metal, the iron, is secreted back into the plasma. That's about 20 milligrams per day. But those 20 milligrams per day go back to the production of the 1% new cells that are essentially compensating for this loss of 1% that we have in the spleen. So the bone marrow utilizes 20 milligrams to make new red blood cells. And this is what continues all the time when normal cells will have, let's say, 135 days of life on the average before they are going to be digested out by the spleen. And in this case, it's also important to know that the release of iron from the spleen into the plasma, that's also blocked by the same hepcidin. So this hepcidin, in fact, blocks all the gates of entry of iron into the plasma, whether they come from the duodenum in the outer world or from the recycling of cells here through the spleen in this case. Now, the interesting story is that the duodenum plays an important role because it's the only place where we can, in fact, compensate for any losses of iron from our organism. This is the only point of entry of iron into our organism, physiological one, of course. So all the control has to be finally focused here on this little piece here, which is about 12 to 15 centimeters. And let's look at that with a little bit higher resolution. So if this is here the duodenum, and precede the duodenum is the stomach. So once we have a form of food, and iron is part of that, iron has to be extracted from the sources here, and that's due to the acidity that we have here in the stomach, and also part the digestion of the proteins and other components. So that now iron, once it is released, it can be absorbed by the duodenum straight into the plasma and signal then the liver. So that's where absorption occurs. But absorption is not only has to do with the properties of the duodenum itself or of the stomach that prepares the substrate to the duodenum, but also what we have in our food and the form of iron that is present. Like for instance, iron in spinach is in the form of oxalate, and the oxalate iron complex are not absorbed at all. The oxalate binds too tight to the metal for our system to absorb it. In the case of cereals, we have phytates that are polyphosphates that bind the metal, and again, they don't easily release it, so we don't get good absorption, and also we don't get good absorption from polyphenols. Now, this is to be taken into consideration when one is in food or mixtures there, because many times we think that we are getting iron, and we do get the iron, but not necessarily in the form which is absorbed. The other part has to do here with factors that can affect the activity of the duodenal cells in absorbing the iron. Here, microbiomes can affect it indirectly or even directly by agents that they produce and do affect here the ability to absorb here the metal. Now, one has to be also aware of the fact that any change in the status of the stomach, let's say if one is using antacids or blockers of the pump called PPI inhibitors, PPIs, and those are proton pump inhibitors, anything that will reduce the pH of the stomach, or if we have extra protein, extra buffering capacity, we are going to reduce the extraction of the metal. So many of the things are going to affect quite a lot the efficacy of the absorption. Now, those are all modulatory factors. But in terms of how this thing works out in the regulation, what happens following absorption? Well, the iron that is absorbed is transferred to the plasma, when it's fully absorbed by a protein called transferrin. So there is never free iron around in the plasma. Whenever iron comes into the plasma, immediately is bound by this protein. And this is the protein that is going to signal now the level of metal in the protein, is going to signal now the liver to essentially lead to the secretion of hepcidin when this level goes high. So we have a receptor for the transferrin, and there's a whole transducing system here that will lead eventually to the production and the secretion of the hepcidin into circulation, and the partial blockade of absorption until we reach more or less a particular level of the metal. And this is the way we maintain physiologically the level of the metal in the cell. But when we have an inflammatory condition, we, via cytokines produced by white cells, particularly pro-inflammatory cytokines, they are recognized by a special receptor on the liver cells, and they also trigger a high secretion of hepcidin, even much higher than we have in the normal condition, the physiological one. And that could lead to a total blockage of absorption of the metal. That is going to explain to us nicely why, when we have inflammatory condition and we block that completely, we get iron deficiency, because we continue to produce some cells until we used up all the metal from the plasma. There is no more metal present there, or hardly any. And eventually, from the iron deficiency, we can also get iron deficiency anemia. So this provides us an explanation. So how do we overcome that? Now let's look at the cycle here again. So that will be the transferrin. This will be like the gut and the way the iron is being delivered, and hepcidin, which will block it. And the same thing, we have it in the reticuloendothelial system. Those are the spleen cells, reticulocytes. We're talking about macrophages in the spleen, that normally what they do is they take all the red blood cells and they digest them and they release the metal, and the metal is now being transported into the plasma. So hepcidin is going to block both of them. Now, in this situation, the physiological situation, we get some sort of steady state levels of the metal in our body. But in the inflammatory condition, where we have a large amount of cytokines, we have a hyperproduction of the metal, and there's a total blockage here. So now transferrin can no longer deliver iron to the bone marrow. How can that be overcome? So the method of choice these days is the use of intravenous forms of iron, so which are in fact, infused into the plasma. This is iron in a particulate form, which kind of mimics the red blood cell, but brings a lot of the iron into the macrophages. So we load them up here, and some of the iron manages just to get out. The blockage is never complete. And that we can partially support the formation of new cells, or what we call erythropoiesis. The big problem is that when we have a continuous high concentration of the metal in those cells, they can be also in the long term deleterious. So another more safer approach is a recent use of a technology based on liposomal iron. This is called, in fact, sucrosomal iron, because they are coated with a special sugar that allows those liposomes to be transported or translocated into the plasma through particular cells. Those are called M cells in the gut. And they go either to the plasma, to the lymph, and so they can deliver iron almost directly to the bone marrow relatively efficiently, and in this way bypass the blockage that we have in the duodenocytes, in those cells. And this is a relatively safe method for iron supplementation, which is by mouth, because those liposomes are quite stable and quite efficient on a daily basis, being taken in order to support erythropoiesis, particularly in cases where everything here is blocked to one degree or another. So now we go to the other question, that if we have resolved most of the problems, at least there are solutions to the different iron deficiencies using different iron sources. We can ask several questions. Why was iron chosen to lead so many of the life reactions? Of course, it must have been present during the time that life was created. And I think there is evidence for that it was present in our planet. It was a very abundant element. And also the other interesting property, it is uniquely equipped with properties to lead to chemical reactions, which are the basis of life. So if we looked at our entire planet, 30% of our planet is composed of iron. Most of that is in the center. But also in the outer crust where we are living, 6% of that is iron, which is quite high, and is the second metal present there. And in terms of chemical activity, it's probably the most chemically active of all uh, in the crust. Of course, it depends in which form it appears in the crust. Now, from the point of view of the reactivity, that's particularly important. And I want just to tell you that for all the periodic tables where we have all the elements, this represents the so-called transition metal row. And I'm stressing that is because here iron is put right in the middle. So in general, iron is just a good acceptor as it is a donor of electrons. And basically all the chemical reactions are essentially either taking or giving electrons or sharing electrons. And that is well said by Albert Seghor, the Nobel Prize winner in 1937 for the discovery of vitamin C. Said that life is but an electron looking for a place to rest, namely to react, and reactions is what we have all the time in our body occurring. And the unique thing about iron, it can cover an enormous range of reactivities, what we call donor or acceptor of electrons, if you like, which is reflected in the redox potential, goes from minus 400 to plus 400 millivolts, covering almost 80% of what we can have in water, in aqueous solutions. So it makes it, a very special metal for leading reactions, and it had been present definitely in the primordial soup from what we know. Definitely matter played an important role in the formation of molecules then, as it is playing an important role today. But it's not enough to have reactivity. Reactivity can also be promiscuity. We need to have reactivity well narrowed to a particular window and to be also specific. And what confers to the iron the specificity and the range of activities is basically a ligand. So a ligand is a group of chemical atoms, that confer a unique chemical environment to the metal and narrow it to a particular level of energy and of width of activities. So if we take, let's say, two examples of molecules that have iron, one is the heme with iron in the center. So those are those groups that are going to determine how reactive this iron is going to be. And the same we have it here with a different form called an iron sulfur cluster, and there are various forms of those clusters. So those are the ligands, what we have all around the metal here, and they will confer to them an activity. An additional specificity is to where we bind the heme in a protein itself. So we can have different proteins, each of which may have a different width of activity or window of activity, but also a different level along this scale of redox potential, namely ability to give or to obtain an electron. And in fact, we can cover here then almost the entire range in numbers of activities in aqueous media. And maybe the best example is when you align them, proteins one after the other. It could be mixed. Some of them iron sulfur clusters, others could be just heme proteins. You can produce here almost like a gradient, and so move an electron from a molecule all the way even to oxygen and reduce the oxygen, which is basically what we have in what's called cellular respiration. We simply move these electrons via proteins organized along this kind of a cascade, what we call an iron bucket brigade that we have. And we need eventually to the reduction of oxygen, which is essentially the cellular respiration. And this is how we derive the largest amount of energy in our body. But the name of the game here as I mentioned to you before, is control, because we not only need the metal, we also have to protect ourselves from the metal, just in case it just gets out of control and it may start producing damage, which, in systems can occur because nothing is absolutely safe in a chemical reaction. So we need to have a very efficient system to absorb the metal and be selective, but also we need to have protective mechanisms as well, both built in. And ideally, these two have to be well coordinated, because whenever we get a metal, there's always a chance that it may get into a undesirable activity. So there are two solutions that we have here for controlling metals in cells. And normally what you need for any control is some sort of sensor of the metal in the cell itself. So one of the sensors we have, let's say in bacterium, it's called FUR, and the other one in mammalian cell, it's called IRPs, but they are both sensors. And those sensors are going to transmit the level of the metal inside the cell to something that can correct those levels if it's too high or too low. And in the case of bacteria, this is mostly done by controlling gene expression. So all the system related to iron uptake and also to the protection of the cell from pro-oxidant activities of the metal that goes in are all under the control of this FUR, because all of them sit on one operon. So all the gene one next to another under similar control. In the case of mammalian cells, this is not done at the gene expression level. The IRPs work on the translational level, but they also can control the iron uptake as well as the iron storage. So any excess of the metal that goes into the cell will lead to the production of a protein that will absorb it and make it essentially inert. That protein is called ferritin. So those are two different solutions that have common features, but also some different ones. And obviously there are some backup systems in terms of antioxidants in our own cells. So whether the cells or the organism are placed in the ocean or they have to take it from a solid source, they have to absorb it, one thing seems to be clear. That first of all, we have to dissolve it in order to bring it into the cell. If you remember when I mentioned to you before, I said that that's exactly what the stomach is doing, is dissolving the metal that comes in the food in an insoluble form and make it now accessible for the duodenum to take it up. But what happens with the root, or what happens with the bacterium that is present in the outer world, let's say in the free environment, they need to grab that, the metal, by first of all solubilizing it. Some of the roots can secrete acids, but mostly what they do is by secreting agents called chelators or siderophores. Those are molecules with very high affinity for the metal that can grab it, and this can be taken up later on either by the root or by the bacterium, and those are analogous mechanisms in both of them. And as I said to you also before, in addition to that, we have to build up an antioxidant pool of agents in order to counteract any possible deleterious effect of the metal which is coming into the cell. Now let's look at the interesting story of what happened in bacteria. So bacteria that need to get iron, let's say in the soil, they are not alone. There are many bacteria, and many of them are competing for the same iron, which is not in that high amount and not in the most accessible form in the soil. So how do they do it? Well, first of all, they do it by secreting. So they have an entire machinery that produces something called a chelator or a siderophore that can bind this metal with very high affinity and make it complex. The affinities are in the order of 10 to the 30, 10 to the 40, which is not found in any reactions in our organism. But bacteria have developed this mechanism. And after capturing the metal from the soil, even though it's almost insoluble, they will, and by the way, this is one of the structures of those siderophores that bind this metal very tightly. It's in the case of this bacterium called Vibrio cholera. This will be taken up by the cell, by the bacterium, by a very special agency that will recognize only this complex. Now, the other bacteria will do something analogous. They have also their own machinery. They have their own siderophore or set of siderophores. They not only rely on one, sometimes they secrete several of them. And they will have an analogous mechanism in obtaining the iron later on after complexation. But some of them also may have developed other mechanisms, we call molecular piracy, and or if you like, parasitism. They would, by a technique or by a method called gene transfer, some of the genes could be transferred from one bacterium into another. So if this bacterium has also acquired this import agency, they don't need to produce all this siderophore in order to acquire the iron. When they have the option that this other bacterium will do the job, and they will steal from this bacterium the complex, and in this way obtain their iron. Now, but that is usually optional because it depends whether or not this other bacterium is present. So nonetheless, bacteria may have multiple systems for acquiring the metal, showing to you how important this was in evolution, and particularly when being in a very competitive market like the soil. Now, what happens in our own organism? Well, we have to defend ourselves also from all kind of intruders, bacteria, that if they want to grow in any particular organ, of course they have to be equipped with the right system for it and get the iron from the kind of source that is present there, like in the case of plasma from transferring, for instance. But in the case of the gut or in the case of the urinary system or the lungs, we also have our own protective mechanisms. Namely, we secrete protective agents that will prevent the bacteria from using the metal. So infections will be minimal here. Now, how this is done? First of all, let me say that the bacteria, some of the bacteria can also penetrate into particular type of cells. Many of the endobacteria like to live within the macrophage, and in the macrophage, they can be in many different compartments. In each of the compartments, the form of iron which will be present there could be completely different. And so they have adapted all kinds of mechanisms to get the iron from the particular milieu where they are located. Now, one interesting example is what happens in our gut. And in the gut, when we have a bacterium, in many cases, we get a lot of extra iron, which could be used by bacteria, and some of those cultures can overgrow in the intestine. So one of the ways our intestine protects itself from an overgrowth of bacteria, particularly from E. coli, is by competing for this metal. But they don't compete with the metal with an siderophore because we don't have mechanisms to produce agents with such high affinity for the metal as the Escherichia coli. So what we produce is a protein called lipocalin. It belongs to the whole family, that they can identify these complexes of aerobactin or enterobactin with iron derived from the E. coli that normally the E. coli will use to obtain the iron. But we are the lipocalins essentially will bind to that and bring that to the cell. The cell has a receptor for lipocalin itself once it's bound to the siderophore. So we compete, we are the pilots here, if you like, that we grab this metal here, not in the free form, but in the form after it has been complexed to the enterobactin or aerobactin. However, we don't have for all type of bacteria this mechanism. For instance, the lipocalins are not useful against Salmonella. The Salmonella managed to evade this process of binding by lipocalins. And the way to overcome this problem usually with Salmonella is to overgrow here the culture in the gut with extra amount of, let's say, probiotics of different types. And in this way, sort of compete for the metal here with a more, what we call friendly type of bacteria. And that's what normally is being done with probiotics. What happens in the blood? Well, I said that transferrin is what protects us from essentially an overgrowth of bacteria in the plasma that need the iron. But some of the bacteria have managed to develop this strategy of using a protein on the surface called TBPA that can dock on the transferrin with relatively high affinity, recognizes a particular site, and it can wrap the metal from the transferrin you bring into bacterium. And over the years, several mutations that have occurred in transferrin sort of evaded this type of binding by this TBPA, but also there are mutations in TBPA that manage to compensate for it. So basically what we have is a continuous antagonistic, what we call coevolution. We are making mutations, they are making mutations. So we have a lot of variants of transferrin, and all of them occur right here at the interface of binding to the TBPA. So we have different degrees of susceptibilities to particular type of bacteria depending on the form of or the mutation that we have in transferrin. Now, clearly what this is telling us is that we have to constantly be adapting or readapting ourselves, what we call the red queen strategy, to maintain ourselves, and this is part of the evolution. Now, last, we're talking about this more universal mechanism that we have of what we call self-induced anemia or metabolic immunity, namely that we are depriving ourselves, we get into a stage of iron starvation in inflammation, and particularly in infections, so that when we have any infections and there are cytokines, we end up really depriving ourselves from iron. Eventually, we can also have the anemia, and we explained how this occurs. This goes by hepcidin, which essentially blocks the entry of the metal into the plasma, and the plasma is depleted. So there are two questions here that we like to address in this case. So if we have an infection and we get cytokines and all the rest, and we get finally deprivation, iron depletion, two things happen here. On the one hand, we can provide some sort of a protection from a pathogen that is present in the plasma, because we deprive them from it ourselves, but also the bacterium, let's say, or pathogen from an essential nutrient. But in the same time, we are piling a lot of the iron in the spleen, in the macrophages here, since iron cannot come out, but still red cells are digested. And this could be a potentially dangerous site, because some endobacteria that like to grow in macrophage may have a preference for those iron or iron-rich macrophages and sort of compromise the person. So what could be a benefit in the plasma could be, in fact, detrimental in the case of endobacterium. So, is this self-induced anemia or metabolic immunity created for that purpose in evolution or not? Most probably, if it was created, it's because the bacteria that posed the largest damage to our survival were not the endobacteria originally. In history, it would have been the case. But that's one of the explanations, but it's still a speculation. So finally, just to finish the presentation, we also observed that from the last example that iron played quite an important role in evolution. I only touched just a little bit about that topic. I want just to bring this quote by Charles Darwin, who said that it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, although depends how one defines intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. So if we say that the intelligent is the one most responsive to change, then there is no contradiction here between the two. And this is definitely correct in the case of iron. And so this kind of adaptation goes on all the time. We see that very well reflected in transferrin, but also in the set of proteins that protect us from some of the bacteria naturally by competing effectively for the iron. Not necessarily for us to survive, but also to prevent, I would say more, to prevent ourselves from succumbing to an invading pathogen. So this is the story that I wanted to tell you today, and thank you for your attention.